Hello, I'm Anabel González, non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to TradeWinds, our virtual event series where we discuss the future of global trade and investment in a changing landscape with leading policymakers and experts from across the world. Thanks to all of you for being here in this celebratory episode of the first anniversary of TradeWinds. Over the course of this year, we have had a set of great speakers addressing some of the most important global and regional trade challenges with an audience that now expands across 109 countries. So we are happy and grateful. This is our 7th episode of TradeWinds in 2021, and we will discuss today, can global trade cooperation be revived in 2021? A topic that is critical for the recovery of the global economy and also for setting the world on a better course. I am delighted to be joined today by two great champions in the trade policy arena. Let me first introduce Cecilia Malmström, Asa Gabrielson Professor at the University of Gothenburg School of Economics. Cecilia has a long and distinguished career in the European Union. As former EU Trade Commissioner from 2014 to 2019, she led the negotiation of trade agreements with Canada, Japan, Mexico, and Mercosur, as well as the EU engagement in the WTO in turbulent times. She previously served as European Commissioner for Home Affairs, member of the European Parliament, and as Swedish Minister for European Affairs. Cecilia is a proud co-founder of Trade Experts, a wonderful network of women trade experts from across the world. And I'm honored to sit with her on the advisory board of the group. Cecilia is joined by Adam Posen, who is first and foremost the president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics since 2013. Over his prolific career, Adam's thought leadership has contributed to the public policy discussions at the highest levels on monetary, fiscal, and trade policy issues. Adam has also done his public service, having been appointed to the Bank of England's rate-setting monetary policy committee in 2009 at a critical time for the world economy. Adam is the recipient of the Honorary Commander of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, of major grants and research fellowships, and he is widely cited and published. For full disclosure, Adam is also my boss at the Peterson and a great promoter and supporter of TradeWinds, for which I am very thankful. So welcome to both of you, and thank you so much for being with us here at TradeWinds. I will turn to Cecilia and Adam in a moment. For you in the audience, please get ready to submit your questions using the Q&A feature in the platform, and we will try to get to as many of them as possible. So according to the World Trade Organization, world merchandise trade volume is expected to increase by 8% in 2021, after falling 5.3% in 2020, a smaller decline than was originally expected. This relative positive short-term outlook for global trade is marked, however, by regional disparities, continued weaknesses in services trade, and lagging vaccination timetables. New waves of infections could potentially undermine recovery, which continues to be subject to uncertainty and downside risks. On the trade policy front, 2021 started off on a relative positive note. After 4 years of disarray, the Biden administration came in with a foreign policy view set on rebuilding alliances and strengthening multilateralism, and more formal processes and procedures for policymaking. And with the trade leadership team now in place, the direction of trade policy is quietly emerging. On the WTO front, after the Biden administration lifted the US veto that hanged over her designation, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala assumed office on March 1 and brought with her a breath of fresh air, renewed energy, and a steadfast focus on delivering results. The European Union recently issued a new trade strategy, emphasizing the role that trade and trade policy cooperation can play at a time of economic transformation and geopolitical instability. The EU puts WTO reform at the front and center of the global trade policy discussions and provides a blueprint for the way forward. It also invites the US and others to engage and work together. So this good news, while refreshing, come against the backdrop of long-standing and serious tensions that have not gone away. Geopolitical competition and the domestic political economy conspire against a smooth US re-engagement in a constructive trade agenda. With deep-seated troubles, the WTO stands at an all-time low. US-China tensions have had a chill effect in the organization, and the pandemic has brought increased frictions. So while a positive force, internal and external challenges constrain the EU's ability to lead. So in this context, let me ask Cecilia and Adam, can increased trade cooperation be expected in 2021? And what would need to happen? So Cecilia, over to you, and welcome again, and thank you very much for being here at TradeWinds.
Thank you very much, Anabel. Good morning to you. It's an honor to be here in TradeWinds with you and Adam, and happy birthday. This is the first anniversary of TradeWinds, and I think you can be very proud because it's extremely successful and very much listened and watched. Good morning and good afternoon and good evening to all of you who are listening as well. So can global trade cooperation be revived? Well, let's certainly hope so, because trade will continue to be a very important element in the recovery post-COVID. As you said, WTO estimates the increase of trade this year to 8%. This is, of course, depending on the vaccine and the rollout and the different possible mutations that can make the recovery later. And we will also see, unfortunately, uneven recovery around the world economically. China going very far ahead, US with its huge package of support, and Europe lagging a bit behind still as well. That can change. And despite the crisis, and with a few hiccups, of course, trade has functioned remarkably well during the pandemic. We have seen resilient value chains and delivery chains. We have seen food and commodities in our shops. Companies have received, by and large, there are a few exceptions, the components that they need. And of course, digital trade has boomed remarkably. So there are global circumstances that are good, but there are also worries. We see increased tendencies of protectionism, nationalism, call for decoupling, self-sufficiency, autonomy. And whereas all that can be understandable to a certain extent when we talk about medical stockpiling to prepare for the next crisis, for instance, and some very specific raw materials where countries are very dependent on one or two suppliers. Overall, this would be very bad for trade if this is put into practice systemically. Companies have already started to diversify a bit, to be more flexible and resilient. And this is a natural development, should not be dictated by politicians, but companies know how to protect themselves and how to go about with this. With the new Biden administration, I think there are good prospects for WTO reform. WTO is, as you said, in huge, urgent need of reform since a long time ago. And I really hope that the European Union, the US, and many other friends of WTO can work together to do reforms there. There are reforms needed in the daily work, increased transparency, the way the committees work. There are far too many committees. There is a new need to make decisions, and there is a need to rewrite the rule book. And we should also make sure that WTO can deliver. There are some quite positive movements in so-called plurilaterals, agreements that are negotiated by a large group of WTO members, around 80, but not all. For instance, in the digital area, e-commerce, there is one on to prohibit fishery subsidies, illegal fishery subsidies. Those could possibly be accelerated and concluded by the end of this year. There is also a proposal on health and trade, where we would take away tariffs on medical equipment and medicines and so on. And this is something where we hope that the US could support. We also need to rewrite the rules. There is a work that has been going on for quite some years, actually under the Trump era already, between US, Europe and Japan, on disciplines on state-owned companies, for instance. This is positive work, and that should continue. And why not take out a dormant proposal where negotiations were quite advanced a couple of years ago, but has been put in the freezer for some time? It's an agreement called EGA, Environmental Goods Agreement, a plurilateral with Europe, US, China, and several others, to make trade in environmentally friendly goods and techniques less expensive. And this is really timely with the ambitions of the climate summit this week and with the new decisions in the European Union as well. So I really hope that this could be taken out again, and that the US would agree on this. And then there is, of course, the need to reform and strengthen the appellate body. This will take some time, but we need to have if you have rules, you need to be able to enforce them, and you need to have this appellate body functioning as well. Now, I guess Adam will talk a little bit about the US trade policy or what could be expected. But in the European Union, I certainly hope that Europe will keep on concluding trade agreements, that we will implement those who are enforced. They have been successful and important for European consumers and companies and for the economy, creating jobs, the one with Canada, Japan, Singapore, etc. It's important also to continue to negotiate those who are underway with Australia, New Zealand, Chile, Tunisia, Indonesia, and that those who are concluded with Mexico and the 4 countries of Mercosur are voted and implemented as well. There is in Europe and in many parts of the world increased pressure on politicians that trade should take a greater responsibility for the sustainable goals, development goals. So there is a push for trade to become fairer and greener. And trade cannot solve this, but trade can make its contribution. So the issue of some kind of green border tax or adjustment tax that's been discussed for quite some time is certainly on the agenda. And the Commission is preparing a proposal this spring already. If we want to combat carbon emissions, we need to tax it. That I think is quite clear, but we need to do this in a clever way that is WTO compatible and that actually leads to results and not creates new tensions. So it would be unfortunate if the EU pushed through alone to do this without working together with US and other partners. This should ideally be done on a global level, and if not possible, at least among the biggest stakeholders, to be discussed in OECD or in G20 or some kind of forum like this. But there are definitely pushes from the public opinion, but also many companies are trying to make their production and their delivery chains much more responsible and sustainable. And that's a good thing, but we will have to do more. Finally, a few words but on EU-US. I said that I hope that the EU and US and others can work to reform the WTO. There are positive signs, and the rhetoric from the White House has been very good in that. But now let's see what will happen on the ground. A few years ago, I negotiated an agreement we called TTIP. It was supposed to be the biggest trade agreement ever between the EU and US. And EU and US are such important trading partners. But this proved to be quite difficult. One would think that it would be natural to have a trade agreement between Europe and the US, but it is quite tricky. That agreement is halfway, 2/3 done, but is now resting somewhere in the freezer. And I don't think it's likely that it will be taken out. It would be interesting to hear Adam's view on this. Both sides are not really ready to do that yet. Developments in Europe and developments in US have made that difficult to foresee for on the short-term basis, at least. But there are things that could be done to rebuild trust and to facilitate trade, mainly in the area of standards, regulations, and so on. And we could emphasize work that has been going on for quite some time to develop joint standards in the green technology sector, for instance, in the cyber sector, and in other new areas where we could develop them jointly instead of having these parallel systems that have proven to be so difficult to reconcile. The fact that the EU and US agreed to suspend retaliation tariffs in the old Boeing and Airbus case is good news. This is a conflict that has been going on for 18 years, that has paid the salary of many lawyers and been the subject of many papers and essays in the academic world. But it's a nuisance and it has to be solved. So the fact that partners are now sitting and trying to find a negotiated solution is very good news. I hope that the US also would suspend their tariffs in steel and aluminium. That was seen as a quite hostile act vis-a-vis partners and allies when that was imposed under Trump. And it has also not functioned. It has not been good for export or for import. Getting away with them would be a very good sign of a new era and sitting together and see what we can do, because the overproduction problem that is basically based in China can be tackled in other ways than imposing tariffs on friends and allies. And I'll end with that. I think also that Europe and US and other allies can do much more vis-a-vis China, to put pressure on China to comply with the promises they made when they adhered to WTO almost 20 years ago, to do the necessary reforms on disciplining state-owned subsidies, on forced technology transfer, on lack of transparency and discriminating rules. There is also a call for a fairer and a more better level playing field in trade with China, and there joint action can be done. Investment screening is an area where we could cooperate even further. And there was, and this is touching the foreign policy, but trade is also very much foreign policy. There was a coordination on the sanctions imposed to China, mainly on the Xinjiang province and the labor camps there. And this is an area where I think deepening cooperation can be done as well. So there's a lot of things to do. There are lots of positive and optimistic things that could be realized if the political will is there. And I certainly hope so, but I'm not naive. I also see that there are clouds in the sky, not only the COVID clouds, but also other political clouds. But I hope at least that part of this agenda can be accomplished in not a very long future. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much for your insightful initial remarks, Cecilia, and we'll get to many of the points that you mentioned in more detail. Let me now turn it over to Adam to see what do you think about increased trade cooperation in 2021. Can we expect more of it?
Thank you, Anabel. But first, let me congratulate you on behalf of the whole Peterson Institute team for the first anniversary of Trade Wins. When you and I started talking about this a little more than a year ago, I had hopes of the potential, and I knew that you were the person to moderate and lead and convene, but you've far exceeded all our expectations. You've created a really top-class venue for trade discussion in the public sphere. You've engaged a wide variety of people from the trade experts and beyond. You have made us really proud and grateful for what you've done, and you've been the model for other event series we've created at Peterson, like Financial Statements with Nicola Varone and Global Connections with Carolyn Atkinson. So I want to thank you, and I also want to thank, in particular from our team, Lily Day, Yvonne Priestley, William Wellington, Oliver Ward, and Anjali Bhatt, all of whom helped make this happen on a twice-a-month ongoing basis. So thank you for that. It's always a privilege for me to be with you and Cecilia, both of whom actually have done the work and made trade deals happen and made trade policy. I am not going to just sit here and counterbalance Cecilia's, I think, pragmatic but hopeful agenda with all the things that could go wrong in Washington. What I would say is I would emphasize 3 points. The first is that we do have to keep the pressure on the Biden administration, and by pressure and we, I mean the global trade community, I mean foreign governments, and particularly allied governments like the EU, that the Biden administration, like every US administration, has competing values and competing constituencies. They're clearly a step up from the Trump administration in that they believe in rule of law. They believe allies should be allies and not treated hostilely. Their motivations are not solely about protectionism, but it also has to be acknowledged they are not rolling back the tariffs on a large scale that the Trump administration did. They have been slow to appoint someone to the appellate body at the WTO. They are doing Buy American. They are doing a number of things. And so I think that the US, and this is something I argued in my new article on foreign affairs, the US has to be subject to more international pressure, not less. And when you move into the climate change area, it is wonderful to see the Biden administration and President Biden stepping up and saying, this is an emergency, not denying it, trying to make changes. But it is also potentially empty for the US to talk about leadership if it doesn't actually do something. And if it goes around and it potentially beats up on those countries that are further behind it on decarbonization, but says to the Europeans or others, please don't put on border adjustment taxes, we're doing the best we can. So I think, and Cecilia and I have been having this discussion going back to since when she was a trade minister for the EU, that the US occasionally needs to get whacked upside the head by foreign governments. It can't just be given a free pass. So I think that's the first thing, that cooperation may have to be accompanied by pressure and calling out the US. Again, it's infinitely better now than it was under Trump. Under Biden, it's much better and better motivated, but still trade is not where they're doing best. The second point is, and Cecilia sort of touched on this, and I know you've spoken about this many times in Trade Winds, Anabel. The second point is the China issue. And we saw this, that even when President Biden was announcing the American Jobs Program, the big broadly defined infrastructure package in Pittsburgh, for a domestic audience, he still invoked China multiple times. And I think we have this imbalance that there are a lot of things that China has done and some continues to do in the world trading system, the world economic system, that we do want US and allies, free market allies like EU, Australia, Japan, to come together and reform and confront. But we also have this completely out of bounds sense of fear and exaggerated hostility towards China. Again, I'm not making any apologies at all to diminish the Chinese Communist Party's horrible behavior on human rights and on freedom, but I'm saying in the economic sphere, the sense of hostility and fear is vastly exaggerated beyond what it should be. If you decide you want to sacrifice economics for security goals, that's a different argument, or human rights goals, as Cecilia spoke about. That's a different argument. Again, I know Trade Winds has talked about this. But on the pure economics, the level of hostility and fear vis-a-vis China is out of control. And that's why I bring up Biden's notion, talking about China and Domestic Infrastructure Act. I mean, why should that be the motivation? Now, that might be because he genuinely believes it. It might be because he thinks it's politically tactical, that this will help get the bill through. I don't know, but it is striking that what a very constructive, domestically oriented effort to try to keep the US from falling further behind its own goals, from failing to serve its citizens with healthcare and clean water, somehow gets framed in terms of China. And so in the trade sphere, what the EU in particular, but also again, other allies, Singapore, Japan, Australia, Chile, Mexico, Canada, are gonna all have to deal with is getting the US to engage in constructive partnership and constructive reform without being forced prematurely to take a side on US and China. And again, if the democratically elected leaders of these countries decide on a human rights foreign policy basis to do something, that's above my pay grade, and that's fine. And I might even support it. But the trade policy can't be run by the US saying everything is you're with us or against us on China. And that is going to be a key theme that we have to manage, that cooperation doesn't come with that string attached, or at least that string doesn't outweigh the benefits of cooperation. And the third point, and I don't mean to distract from your and Cecilia's very right focus, is just that we have to look at trade in the broader context, that there are issues, as you and Cecilia both know well, of technology transfer, of technology competition, of industrial policy that are very heated, somewhat deservedly so, somewhat overheated, but that these issues of deeper integration that are not covered under WTO right now, or are only covered in terms of their trade effects, are where a lot of the cooperation and non-cooperation is going to come. And this includes sanctions issues that I know you've spoken about with our colleagues, as well as on trade winds. And we have to think hard about how much progress you can make on trade while you're doing things divergently on technology controls or on mergers and acquisitions or on unilateral sanctions. And probably the answer is, since we never have perfection, I'd be interested in what you and Cecilia have to say, is you do the best you can on trade, and you also do the best you can on other things. And I think that's the right response. But I just want to feature that trade cooperation is only part of the picture. I guess the one thing I would add, and I'm sorry to go on so long, is just to say you've both mentioned the WTO. And I had the privilege to appear with Ngozi at the Bao Forum, the other day, and with Jeffrey Yu and a number of other trade luminaries. And I think, again, I'm not just blowing smoke, I genuinely praised the Director General for her pragmatic approach about saying we have to get some things done to demonstrate the worth of the WTO, also because they're important. And I would just, for the American context, I would emphasize this even more than she does. I mean, WTO reform, for all that the trade lawyers and USTR types talk about it, is really not an issue for the American politician, or the American public. The issue for the American public is, what's a fair way of trading in vaccines? What's a reasonable way of making sure there's enough food that doesn't interfere with GMOs or US agriculture? What is fisheries is less an issue for the US and for some other countries, but that's the third of the issues that Ngozi has raised as priority. There are, and then of course, climate change, how as Cecilia mentioned. And so I would rather the WTO not get caught up in sort of Geneva discussions of reform and administration, and more focus on deliverables in various areas, and then the support will come. I think Ngozi says that, but I just want to emphasize that.
Okay. Thank you very much, Adam. I think you've made some great points, and what I would like to do now is start going a bit deeper into each of the topics that you've both mentioned. So let me maybe start with the EU-US trade relations. Cecilia mentioned a positive sign, which was the suspension for 4 months of the retaliatory tariffs in the Airbus Boeing case, presumably to allow for engaging in some conversations. Another interesting development seems to be increased greater alignment, if one may say so, between the two partners on the issue of digital services tax. But still in tariffs on imports from the EU and others are still there. So I want to sort of I have a question, like three-part question on this EU-US relationship. The first one is, how feasible is it to tackle this bilateral conflicts to put the US-EU relationship on a better course? Is there a need to tackle this bilateral irritants? Second is there a need for some kind of a structure or a framework to promote this dialogue, like the Trade and Technology Council that the EU has been proposing? And on the way forward, what could be areas for collaboration? Could it be digital trade, or are you two a part of this? Could it be trade and environmental sustainability? Both of you have talked about the importance of trade contributing to address some of the climate challenges. But can cooperation be expected here, or are perspectives on issues like carbon border adjustment measures just too far away, and again, potentially leading to conflict? Bearing in mind, I think this broader context that Adam was mentioning, which I think it's very interesting that he highlights the point that, of course, trade can sometimes be impacted by other considerations, security and others. But presumably that should happen the other way around. I mean, not only in a negative way, but also in a positive way, particularly in terms of building alliances. So Cecilia, let me maybe start with you, and then I'll come back to you, Adam.
Well, yes, I think there is still a need to actually do some concrete confidence building measures. After the victory of President Biden, many countries in the world, and especially in Europe, not all, but most of them, were very happy, because the last 4 years there's been a lot of tension between Europe and the US. And while these have happened in the past as well, the sort of historical transatlantic friendship and close cooperation took a lot during these 4 years, and that's unfortunate. But so you still have some trust building to do, and having this moratorium on the punitive retaliatory tariffs on Boeing and Airbus, it's a good thing. Getting away with the steel and aluminium tariffs would be very good as well, because they are costly to European industry, but they've also been costly to Americans. They have not served its purpose. So getting away with them would also send a good sign of cooperation. And then, starting to sit together in the Ottawa group, which is a group of like-minded WTO friends, to sit and see what can be done. And I agree with Adam, starting with a few concrete deliveries so that people see that WTO still serves its purpose. And then the sort of institutional changes are needed, but they can take a different sort of track at the same time. And I wish Dr. Ngozi good luck. I think she's very good for the job, but she needs, of course, support by the member states. If you look back at the European EU-US cooperation, there's been several of these. There's been the new transatlantic agenda, there's been the transatlantic partnership, there's been the transatlantic economic council, and now the Commission proposed something else. So whatever the forum, whatever it's called, it needs to be something concrete where you can actually put people together and solve joint problems, define standards, talk about cybersecurity, cyber standards, talk about what Adam mentioned, technology competition and how we address this. Maybe talk about digital and environmental taxes as well, but it has to be defined what to do. It shouldn't be just a talking shop, but it has, I think it could be very positive and has shown in the past, even if all these councils have come and gone, to put people who are actually working on the ground with this, to compare notes and to see what can be done together. So I'm positive to this, but it doesn't have to be called this or that. It doesn't have to be very institutionalized, but it has to have a concrete agenda where both partners can feel that we are actually making progress. Trade would be one issue, but it should be much broader, of course, to do this. And again, this is a confidence building measure. On the digital tax and environmental tax or carbon tax, it has different names. This would really be important to discuss. On digital tax, there has been huge progress within the OECD, who leads on, given the mission by G20 to try to solve this. There are 140 countries actually participating in this, and with the declarations of the Biden administration, with Secretary Yellen, I think that has put some good momentum in it. There are a lot of advances there. It's not to be concluded tomorrow, but with the political will and some compromises, it could be concluded by the end of the year, actually. Carbon tax will be more tricky because the European Union is very committed to do this, and it has the support of citizens and the European Parliament. But this is an area where dialogue is really needed with US and other partners so that we get it right and that we get it to be a global tool and not create new tensions, because it could potentially do that. And I hope that there is this environmental summit this afternoon and tomorrow. Maybe it won't be discussed there, but at least in the follow-up of this, that there can be discussions on how to approach this from a common ground.
All right, thank you, Cecilia. Adam, your views on US-EU?
I just want to strongly agree with Cecilia on the criticality of the digital and global corporate tax to go with the environmental. That the US-EU, there's a certain amount of friction that's inherent. We've all been dealing with chickens and pickup trucks for our entire professional lives. And that's just the nature of having an ongoing, highly integrated trade relationship between economies that are at a similar stage of development. So I completely agree I commend Cecilia and the current DG, Sabina Weyand, for their role in getting rid of the unnecessary Airbus-Boeing escalation, because again, that's not going to go anywhere. So it's like arms control. Why don't we both just forego this and leave it where it was? The digital tax, or rather the corporate tax, which implies a digital tax at a global level, I think is one of the two potential fundamental breakthroughs in US-EU economic relations writ broad. And I commend Secretary Yellen and the Biden administration for going right for this. I had advocated for this and forecast that they would move faster than people thought, but they've moved faster than I hoped. And I also agree with Cecilia. I think there is a good chance that before the end of the calendar year, we could have a deal. And what, of course, is critical in this is the US government deciding, rightly, that digital tax doesn't necessarily have to be seen as an attack on American headquartered companies' dominance. And that for that matter, the value to the US citizens of US companies' dominance is not very high if they don't pay any taxes in the US. So I think that this is the kind of thing that could make a breakthrough, both in terms of what it actually means for revenues, removing a more fundamental contest between US and EU that isn't just an ongoing friction, but is a genuine divergence, and demonstrating to the American political class and the American public that international cooperation is useful and necessary for dealing with certain problems. It's not all about defending yourself from the international sphere. So I view this as critically important. Now, as Cecilia knows well, mapping that onto trade and other things, though, then becomes difficult because it is a question of silos. The OECD is different than the WTO. The finance ministry is negotiating on digital taxation or on international corporate minimum tax is different than the trade ministry is negotiating on Airbus, Boeing, or on border adjustment for carbon. So I tend, maybe it's because I've spent too long in Washington, but I tend to view spillovers from one area to the other area, even when there's good progress made. I view the spillovers as limited, but this one I think is big.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. I think we had two questions from our audience, from Hildegard and from Vandana, that were actually asking about the digital services tax, because as you say, I think there is this recognition that a potential breakthrough in this area would be quite relevant, certainly for the US-EU relations, but more broadly to the rest of the world, I think. And from a trade perspective, at a minimum, it would take out a major irritant with a number of countries. So it would be a good way of reinforcing this idea of trade cooperation that we're discussing. So let me now move to another area, which is WTO reform that both of you have referred to. When you look at the EU new trade strategy, you see that this is a big part of it. It's actually an independent annex that is almost as long, I think, as the strategy itself. And 2 points I'd like to highlight here. The EU sort of recognizes that the US has raised valid concerns on the appellate body, which is something that has been very important for the US, and invites the US to sit down in good faith and negotiate in this area. And also, the EU also supports a more effective WTO negotiating function, talking about a number of topics that are relevant for the US, including competitive distortions due to state interventions in the economy, tackling the issue of special and differential treatment, and others. So clearly, the EU is invested in WTO reform, but WTO reform cannot happen without the US engagement. So, Adam, what do you think? What can we expect from the US in the WTO?
Well, as you and I both know, Anabel, it was a great breakthrough that the Biden administration did not unduly delay the affirmation of Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala as Director General. That was the right thing to do, both on the merits and on the fact that she had the support of so many, no disrespect to the South Korean candidate. So that was good. I still remain flummoxed that they don't want to yet appoint somebody to the appellate body. I find the complaints about the appellate body as the most bizarre part of complaining about the WTO, because it's actually really useful and pretty well functioning. As with court cases in the US and many other countries, for those of us who are non-lawyers, we don't understand why it takes 2 years to go through the evidence and give lawyers lots of billing time and not just make a decision. So fine, okay. But the fact is that the appellate body has been useful in resolving important disputes and, more importantly, tamping down spillovers and conflicts that could have erupted. And we saw this in the way that there was a substitute process that I remember discussing with Cecilia a while back of going forward without the US, because everybody found it useful when the US was playing. So I don't understand why the US government is so fixated on this. I assume it's because there are specific senators in both parties who for some reason are just obsessed with this. And that's just an unfortunate reality. In terms of other aspects of WTO reform, however, it gets more meaty and more interesting. And I'm very pleased, as I know you are, that Alan Wolf, who just stepped down as one of the acting director generals of the WTO, is now a distinguished visiting fellow at Peterson, and he's going to be holding his views out soon. We're going to do an event with him in a week talking about some of his views. Sorry to make the plug, but I think it's important. Alan has a lot to say on this. I think the biggest piece of WTO reform, and this is where I break with some of the trade community, is not bemoaning the lack of the Doha round, not bemoaning the lack of single undertakings, not bemoaning these very large scale ambitions that just have come to naught. I think accepting that the WTO is, while multilateral in its legal state, is mostly at this point about facilitating and policing bilateral and plurilateral arrangements, I think is the right way to go. And I think that view, again, as a pragmatic outcome, would take some hold in the US if that's pursued. I recognize not everyone agrees with that view.
Thank you, Adam. Well, but you know, with 164 members and so many different topics on the agenda, it is only natural that some countries would want to, get together and make progress in one particular area, and some maybe not in others. But it is true that it is not everyone holds the same view, but could certainly, open an avenue to move forward and modernize, as one of our participants, Jean DeTroyer, speaks about modernizing the WTO. So Cecilia, let me come to you now and ask you about one particular area of critical concern, of course, to the world right now, which is vaccine nationalism, including measures by the US and the EU and others to curb exports of vaccines and key ingredients. So what would be, in your view, an improved course of action to provide equitable access to vaccines worldwide?
Yes, thank you. Well, I deeply regret the different actions of export limitations and vaccine nationalism, although I can understand that the citizens' pressure on politicians is huge, and the vaccine rollout is too slow in too many countries. So of course the pressure from politicians to do and to deliver and to get your own population vaccinated is understandable. However, prohibiting exports of vaccine will only backfire, because this pandemic will not disappear until the whole world is vaccinated. Because with globalization and with our traveling patterns and our interactions, we cannot forget big parts of the world. We need to share. And we need to do that through COVAX. I hope the US will join that as well. And we need to make sure that we can contribute neighbors and others to share that. So export limitations in this is well, it's not good. I'm really against it. And I hope that will stop, because it can lead to no good.
Thank you, Cecilia. So Adam, we know that at Peterson, Chad Bown and other colleagues have done a lot of work and continue to do a lot of work in this area. What is your take on vaccine nationalism, and how is it that, what could be an improved course of action to provide for equitable access worldwide?
Well, I want to give a shout out to our colleague Chad Bown at Peterson and his co-author Tom Boyke, who have done incredible work on the vaccine nationalism view ahead of when it was out there. But there's also obviously a number of things coming out of Gavi, where COVAX, where Ngozi used to work, and other players in this field. There's just no getting around the fact that greater transparency and more equitable distribution of the vaccines is not some idealized thing. It's, as Cecilia said, as Chad and Tom said, as Monica Debola, our colleague, and Morioso said, and is now a truism. If you don't control the vaccine, the pandemic almost everywhere, you're just building up the risk of it not being contained anywhere. And it's a truism, but it's time to act on it. And I view this as less an issue of intellectual property rights and more an issue of spending the money, redistributing supplies, and just getting it done. We've seen in the UK, in the US, in Israel, in Taiwan, in various places, that even countries that messed up initially can get it together and do a good job on vaccine distribution. Our colleague Jacob Kierkegaard is making the case that Europe is about to catch up over coming months. So as evil as it has been that the US and Europe have not shared vaccine doses with their neighbors, let alone with the developing world, all right, within 2 months, we can see that a substantial share of the rich world population will have been vaccinated. So time to get busy, time to distribute more. Sorry, I do not have a terribly sophisticated take on this. I just think we can get it done, and we should.
Thank you, Adam. So let me move now to a quick discussion on China. We know that the EU concluded the comprehensive agreement with China in December, sort of charting a course for itself in dealing with Beijing. We now know that the future of that agreement is a bit tied up with all this sanctioning going back and forth. But the episode shows that while great cooperation between the US and the EU on issues related to China is possible, it is also true that parties come at this from different perspectives. And Adam was making what I think is an excellent point, which is a bit of the putting this issue a bit out of dimension, I guess, in the US. But in any case, what do you think is the scope for US-EU cooperation in addressing shared concerns about China? We have one of our participants, Petra Seinhofer, asked of Cecilia and maybe of Adam, would you vote for or against the EU-China Comprehensive Agreement on Investment? But beyond that, really, the question is, what obstacles would stand in the way of greater collaboration? So Cecilia, let me maybe turn it to you first, and then I'll come to Adam.
Yes, thank you. I know you had a special program on the CIA with Sabine Weiland, so I won't go into detail. But of course, in the agreement, there are several very important successes from the EU point of view. There are agreements on discipline on state-owned companies, on forced technology transfer, on transparency, on non-discrimination, etc., which are important. And it shows that even if it's only on paper for the moment, China can agree on this. And these are issues that EU, US, and tons of countries have brought up vis-a-vis China in the WTO context as well. So if they can agree with EU, it means that they could agree also in the WTO, because these are kind of the promises that made, as I said, when they joined the WTO. So that is important. Of course, when it comes to other elements, this is not a trade agreement, it's an investment agreement. So it doesn't go very far on other items, but that was not the intention. Of course, it is weak on trade and sustainable development, for instance, and that's why I think even before the sanctions, it would have been very difficult to pass the European Parliament. So I think in its current form, it will not pass the European Parliament, and several countries are suspicious as well. So probably have to be modified, and also something in the sanctions need to, we need to see where that is going. But having said that, I think there is plenty of scope to continue collaboration that has existed between the EU and US and also Japan on trying to draft WTO rules on these disciplines, not only for China. Other countries are also sinning, even if China is the biggest sinner, so to say. We could do that jointly together. We can cooperate when it comes to critical investment, where there are growing concerns on some, not all, but some Chinese investment that comes with a price, a political price. And I think if we're going to do anything on human rights, labor rights, and trade, we have much better prospects of succeeding if we do it together, not only Europe and US, but also other like-minded countries to put pressure. For instance, there is a growing consumers movement on boycotting goods that come from the Xinjiang province that are probably made in these forced labor camps with the Uyghur community or minority. So these are things where I see scope of cooperation, but also at the same time showing that on other items, while we can be very critical towards China when it comes to things that are not satisfactory in the level playing field of trade, but also human rights, lack of rule of law, etc. But there are areas where we should and must cooperate, for instance, in the climate area, and to reform WTO. We need China there. So and there, I hope for a slightly different rhetoric from the US as well, to see that there are really areas where also you have to do both things at the same time, especially with a huge superpower like China.
Thank you, Cecilia. Adam, your views, please.
Yes. So here I'm very similar to where Cecilia is. I would just say, again, we've been talking about this for a while, and I know you have, Anabel, that 3 years ago or so, ahead of the ministerial in Buenos Aires, the Japanese government, the EU representatives, the US representatives, even with Lighthizer USTR, had a very solid draft subsidies code to go into the WTO that would deal with a lot of the China issues, but do it in a multilateral, not just China-threatening way. I don't think the substance has changed in terms of the situation. That code is pretty well drafted. I was hoping that for both reasons of quality and ease from a bureaucratic point of view, would just get picked up by the trio and brought forward. And I still think that can happen. And I mean, that's just echoing something Cecilia said. On the climate thing, I want to make a virtue of a necessity. I mentioned earlier that, I tend to think that these siloed issues, the positive, negative spillovers are not very large, even though people always talk about building trust and atmosphere and so on. I think the fact that President Xi is coming to the climate summit, which was announced, I believe, overnight, is quite amazing that he is not choosing to say my first international encounter with President Biden has to be bilateral and has to be in a neutral venue. And I think the Chinese government, for all their faults and crimes, is quite capable of segmenting its policies. And so I think with the EU's encouragement, the US and China have to accept the open hand from each other that they both want to make progress on climate. And I think for domestic reasons, President Xi, and he's shown this in his own priorities domestically, does care about climate. Again, it's not ideal, and if he's busy funding coal and messy steel plants, then he's hurting climate, so I don't want to overstate it. But I think the idea that we can make progress on climate, even if other things are not going well in the US-EU relationship with China, can be taken at face value and should be pursued. And I commend both the Chinese and the American governments for behaving that way. I think Secretary of State Blinken said we can walk and chew gum at the same time. And that's not always true, but in this case, I think that's right.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Adam. I want to squeeze in, I mean, it's a complex question, but a few words from you on one point, which is the EU and the US trade agendas have become increasingly value-driven, with significant attention being placed on issues like strengthening enforcement in areas, for instance, such as labor. Do you think that this area of commonality between the two partners will put them on a clash course with many developing countries who fear protectionist intent behind well-intentioned agendas, Cecilia?
Well, this goes totally in line with what I said in the beginning, that citizens, consumers in Europe and elsewhere expect trade to take a larger responsibility for the sustainable development goals. And that includes human rights, sustainability, labor rights. Trade cannot solve all that, but it can contribute. And what we have in our trade agreements in the EU, and I think US is increasingly moving in that direction as well, and several other countries, is reference to internationally agreed conventions. So we don't invent new sort of values. We refer to internationally agreed and signed conventions, not always implemented by countries, but they are there. And that is made clear from the very beginning. When it comes to developing countries, there are sort of also incentives to help these countries to work, to accomplish them, to make sure that it can be fulfilled. So there is aid and trade in regard to that, in order to make sure that they can go up to standards, to conventions that they very often signed, even if they haven't implemented it. So I think that is a trend in trade policy that will remain, and it will spread all over the world. So countries will have to live with it and try to find ways to actually live up to commitments that they have made internationally.
Thank you, Cecilia. Adam?
Yes, I agree. And just to say that, if the US and Europe and others are going to set higher standards and say it's about standards, then they have to deliver on vaccines. So unfortunately for the world, it all comes back to that right now. And so again, I commend Ngosi's emphasis on that, and that's the problem that has to be worked.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're getting to the end of our episode, but it's been a great conversation. So thank you, Cecilia Malmström and Adam Posen, for a great conversation on global trade cooperation in 2021. I want to make a plug for an event that Adam has tomorrow at Peterson on the price of American economic nostalgia, because I do think it's a bit of an interesting segue into all of the discussions that we've had so far, because somehow it explains what is going on in the US, and what I think is really a brilliant way. So I hope to see you, hope to see many of you tomorrow, 1 p.m. Eastern time on this event. As we are in this celebratory mode, I would also like to thank my Peterson colleagues for their fantastic support of TradeWinds. Anna mentioned them. I also like to thank Steve Lily, Rebecca, Angeli, William, Oliver, and of course, all of our PIIE fellows and guests who have joined us at TradeWinds. And to our audience, please join us in our next episode of TradeWinds on Wednesday, May 5. As part of this set of celebrations, we will have a special 90-minute episode on digital trade with Simon Evedet, who will be presenting the second pillar of the Global Trade Alert, focused on monitoring policies in these areas, and a distinguished panel of experts to follow in discussing digital trade negotiations. So until then, thank you all and goodbye. Thank
you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Here's to another year of TradeWinds, Anabel. It's been great. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.